In this segment, we're going to talk about morphology. We're introducing morphology now as a way of saying what kind of effects show up in other languages that maybe we haven't been thinking about from the context of English. And this is going to help us think about how the tools that we've developed so far in this course can really be broadened and generalized to work in a lot of different settings. So morphology is roughly the study of how words form. And so, it's not that this doesn't apply to English, certainly, but what we're going to see is that there are many effects from morphology that come up in other languages that are going to fundamentally change how we have to think about building our systems. So roughly, morphology is broken into two sort of sub-areas. There's what's called derivational morphology, which is how we think about creating new words or what we call lexemes from a base. And so, for example, the verb estrange can become the noun estrangement. And there's kind of regular processes for doing this. In English, they involve adding different suffixes or kind of transforming things in different ways. But these processes aren't always totally regular, but still there's a lot that we can study there in terms of, again, essentially how these words are formed from their pieces. What we're going to think about here more is what we call inflectional morphology. This is how words appear differently based on the context that they occur in. So for example, you say, I become or she becomes. Right? So basically verb conjugation with its subject is an instance of this. And why do we write the word become in two different ways based on what the subject is? So there's a lot of reasons. One is that this helps make it a little bit more apparent who the subject of this verb is and kind of exactly what's going on here. So this kind of thing mostly applies to verbs and nouns, as we're going to see. But the kind of key thing about it is that the kind of inflectional morphology in English is relatively impoverished, right? So we could think about sort of different pronouns that we might use with basically first, second, third person, singular versus plural, and then things like past tense. And there's only a few different forms of the verb arrive, right? Arrive, arrives, arrived. Arriving, we're not going to talk about participles and gerunds and things like that. But in French, it's a much more complex story. So there are still some of these that are, kind of present tense ones that don't have too many different ways that they are spelled. But then we have all these other tenses like the imperfect, the future, the conditional, etc., which in English are largely composed tenses. You say like, I will do something or I would do something. But in French, this all gets like baked into the basically inflectional morphology of the verb. What is its suffix in this case? And so immediately this is going to lead to there not just being three forms of arrive, but many, many more. And it's the same deal in Spanish for llegar. I'm not going to again walk through all these different forms, but you can see that there's many different ways that this gets spelled and kind of conjugated, right? And it turns out it's not just verbs. There's also inflection of nouns in other languages. So we do have this in English with singular versus plural, but other languages have much more complex morphological systems involving things like case. So case is roughly kind of where a noun shows up grammatically. And so in English, the one real manifestation of case we have is with pronouns. When you say like, I gave it to him, the him is in subject position, and that's accusative case. Actually, well, let's say, I hit him. That's an instance of accusative case, and I is an instance of nominative case there. You also have genitive case, and then dative is, in English, it's kind of merged with the accusative, but it basically indicates someone receiving something rather than being like the kind of direct object of that thing. In German, however, these end up being different. So for example, I taught the children, ich unterrichte die Kinder, versus I gave the children a book, ich gebe den Kindern ein Buch. And so we have to, again, deal with different forms of this noun now based on where it shows up. And this is going to, again, kind of blow up the complexity of what we're doing, both from the perspective of having to generate this stuff. We would have to generate it using the correct, using the correct case and everything. And also from the perspective of analysis. For example, if you're going to train glove embeddings, now you need suddenly many, many more embeddings for forms of the verb arrive. Okay, so the nice thing is that even though these inflections are very complicated, a lot of times they're regular. Where these things are irregular is with common words. So for example, forms of the verb to be usually kind of don't have the same patterns as other verbs in a language. And when you have less common words, it's usually kind of predictable based on like the suffix or some sort of information what so-called paradigm they would fall into. Okay, and just to give one other example, we have a set of languages, the Finno-Ugric languages and Turkic languages, which are called agglutinating languages, which the kind of morphology here becomes even crazier because basically they roll up the function of prepositions with the verb. And so you end up with this very, very complicated structure here of kind of different forms of these things. And, you only ever see a few forms of these more complicated cases. And it's still a regular process. Like you're basically kind of gluing a suffix on to this word, but that's happening in a much, it's happening in a way that produces a lot of different word forms. So basically the story for these languages is, again, even one step more complicated, where we want to think about how to kind of break up these words into smaller pieces and deal with them that way. So the kind of final thing I'll leave here is that many languages spoken all over the world have morphology that's much more complex than that in English. So this is a problem that we've really kind of ignored from the standpoint of this course, but it's a really serious one. And we need to think about it when we build systems. There are a few data sets for thinking about dependency parsing and syntactic and constituency parsing for morphologically rich languages and other kinds of analysis. But generating into these languages, for example, has a whole host of other issues. So the good news is that a lot of the techniques that we developed for handling machine translation, things like word piece or byte pair encoding models, which showed up in pre-training as well, these could be pretty good at handling these sorts of effects if you have enough data. For example, all these complex suffixes in agglutinating languages, ideally these are the kinds of things that would get broken up into word pieces or subword tokens. And then our model would be able to analyze this thing in a sort of compositional fashion. So we're going to talk a little bit more in the next segment about how to analyze what's going on with morphology. But this gives you a tour of like roughly what the effects are and some ideas of how we might go about addressing them. That's the end of this segment.